The static was a living thing, a constant, hissing breath that filled the cluttered space of Alara's workshop. It was the only sound that felt real to her. In the cavernous underworld of Neo-Atlas, reality was a curated commodity, a seamless stream of augmented skies and artificial sunsets projected onto the endless concrete ceilings high above. Everyone else saw a perfect, perpetual twilight, but Alara saw the flicker at the edges, the ghost of the machinery behind the mirage. It was a gilded cage, and she had spent her 19 years rattling the bars. Her sanctuary was a repurposed maintenance closet, a vertical slice of chaos wedged between groaning ventilation shafts. The walls were a tapestry of scavenged circuit boards, spools of copper wire, and the skeletal forms of half-built antennas. Their twisted metal limbs reached for the low ceiling as if trying to scratch through the layers of city above to something purer. The air smelled of hot solder, ozone, and the faint, ever-present tang of recycled air. This was where she came to escape the suffocating sameness, to listen to the white noise that the city tried so hard to bury beneath its neon symphony. Tonight, her fingers moved with a practiced, restless energy, weaving a new receptor dish from a salvaged satellite pan and a tangle of fiber-optic cables. Each twist of the wire was a small act of rebellion against the curated silence. She powered up the rig and the speakers crackled to life, filling the room with the chaotic chorus of a million digital voices, encrypted corporate chatter, pirated entertainment streams, the dull thrum of the city's network heartbeat. It was the sound of Neo-Atlas itself, a cacophony she knew as well as her own. She tuned through the frequencies, a digital flaneur wandering invisible streets. Past the booming advertisements for OmniCorp's latest bliss-inducing AR filters, past the droning public service announcements about the irradiated, uninhabitable surface. It was all the same noise, just packaged differently. Her hand slowed, the dial turning with a more delicate precision as she sought the empty spaces, the quiet voids between the channels. And then she found it. There, nestled deep within a pocket of seemingly dead air, was a whisper, a faint, rhythmic pulse buried under layers of interference. It was so quiet it was almost a feeling rather than a sound, a ghost in the machine. Alara leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. She adjusted the gain, her knuckles white, filtering out the hiss until the signal emerged, fragile but distinct. A repeating sequence. 3 short pulses, a long drawl of sound, then 2 more quick bursts. It looped without variation, a lonely, mechanical heartbeat echoing from a place that, according to every official map and database, did not exist. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the room's chill, traced its way down her spine. This was not city noise. This was something else, something old and deliberate. Secret whispered on a forgotten wavelength. It was a crack in the perfect, monotonous facade of her world, and through it, Alara felt the first, dangerous stirrings of a curiosity that promised to unravel everything. For 3 days, the ghost in the machine consumed her. Alara moved through her mandated data entry shifts in a fog, her fingers typing out meaningless strings while her mind was back in the workshop, chasing that faint, repeating pulse. The curated neon of the city streets felt more garish, the canned laughter from public view screens more hollow. The signal was a splinter in her mind, an itch she could not scratch in the open. It was a secret, and in Neo-Atlas, secrets were the most valuable and most dangerous currency. In the sanctuary of her workshop, she had isolated the signal, capturing its digital fingerprint in a shielded data cache. The raw audio was a string of tonal shifts, a simple pattern that felt almost archaic in its design. Her decoding software, patchwork of her own design and scavenged corporate code, chewed through the data, translating the tones into numbers. The result was a short, elegant loop of geographic coordinates, scrolling across her primary monitor in stark green text. A thrill, sharp and electric, shot through her. These were not random numbers, they were a destination. She immediately cross-referenced them against the official OmniCorp civic grid, the sprawling digital map that dictated every sanctioned movement within the metropolis. The search returned a single, blinking result: coordinates not found. She ran it again, then a third time, each iteration fueling a growing knot of suspicion in her gut. The official map was supposed to be absolute, a perfect digital replica of the city's multi-layered reality. For a location to not exist within it was not an error, it was an erasure. Her console chimed with an incoming connection request. It was Leo. She accepted, and his face materialized in a hollow window, his expression pinched with its usual blend of concern and caffeine-fueled alertness. The glow of his own bank of monitors reflected in his glasses. She didn't speak, simply shared her screen, the loop of non-existent coordinates continuing their silent dance. Lee watched for a full minute, his fingers steepled under his chin. He was a data analyst for the city's logistics arm, a cautious man who believed that survival was a game of noticing the patterns everyone else missed. He saw the patterns here and he did not like them. "You need to stop." His voice was a low, tense whisper through the comm, even though they were on a secured line. "Right now, Alara." He leaned closer to his own pickup, his image flickering. "Signals like this don't just appear. They are either sanctioned and therefore logged, or they are unsanctioned and therefore hunted. If OmniCorp signal sweepers catch a whiff of this, if they trace it back to your hardware." He let the sentence hang, the unspoken consequence heavier than any warning. They both knew the stories of curious citizens who had tapped into the wrong data stream, who had simply vanished into the corporate enclaves, their digital footprints scrubbed from existence. "It's a place, Leo," Alara countered, her voice tight with a fervor he clearly lacked. "A real place that isn't on any map. Don't you want to know why?" "I want to keep my access codes and my freedom," he replied flatly. "Curiosity is a luxury we can't afford." "They have eyes everywhere, Alara. Not just cameras. Algorithms that track anomalies, that flag deviations from the norm. Your search queries alone are a trail of breadcrumbs leading right to your door." He was right, of course. The air in Neo Atlas was thick with invisible surveillance, a digital panopticon that maintained order through the perpetual threat of being seen. But as Alara looked from Leo's worried face back to the glowing numbers on her screen, the fear was overshadowed by a deeper, more compelling emotion. It was the same feeling that had driven her to build her first antenna, the need to know what lay beyond the projected horizon. OmniCorp had gone to a great deal of trouble to hide this. That alone made it worth finding. Leo's warning was a door slamming shut, but for Alara, the coordinates were a key, and she was already turning it in the lock. The hunt was a silent war waged in the ghostly architecture of Neo Atlas's digital underbelly. Leo's warnings were a constant, buzzing hum in the back of Alara's mind, a reminder of the invisible tripwires lacing the city's networks. But the coordinates were a siren's call, their silent, looping promise a stronger pull than any fear. They were a question that had been planted in the sterile soil of her world, and it had taken root, its tendrils now wrapped tightly around her resolve. She would find the truth, or she would break herself trying. Her workshop became a command center for a one-woman insurgency. The clutter of hardware was now a fortress, her jury-rigged servers shielded behind layers of signal-dampening foil and misdirection protocols. She worked by the cold, blue light of her primary monitor, her face a pale mask of concentration. The first step was to go deeper than the public-facing civic grid, to plunge into the archival strata of data that OmniCorp had buried beneath layers of obfuscation and encryption. This was where the city kept its secrets and its ghosts. Her fingers flew across the interface, deploying a suite of custom-built intrusion scripts. They were digital lockpicks, elegant and nearly untraceable, designed to slide between the seams of corporate firewalls without triggering alarms. She bypassed the main data conduits, instead routing her connection through a daisy chain of forgotten public terminals and derelict infrastructure nodes, creating a ghost path that would be almost impossible to follow. The air in the room grew thick with the heat of overworked processors, the only sound the frantic whirring of cooling fans fighting a losing battle. After hours of meticulous probing, she found it. A forgotten server cluster designated for historical urban planning, a digital tomb sealed behind a wall of deprecated code. With a final, whispered command, she breached the encryption. The screen flooded with a cascade of files, their headers stamped with dates from nearly a century past. These were the architectural ghosts, the original schematics and survey maps of Niu Atlas from its founding era. Pulling up the files alongside the current city layout was like holding two different worlds in her hands. The modern map was a study in brutalist efficiency, a vertical labyrinth of residential blocks, commercial sectors, and industrial zones, all contained, all controlled. But the archived maps told a different story. They showed wider avenues, grand plazas, and, most tellingly, entire sectors that were now labeled as structural voids or condemned maintenance zones. The discrepancies were not minor errors. They were deliberate excisions, whole chapters of the city's geography surgically removed from public record. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she overlaid the signal's coordinates onto the archaic map. The blinking dots settled not in an empty void, but directly over a sector labeled Terminus Reach, a place that, according to current records, had been sealed during the Great Containment. The official history cited structural instability and residual radiation. The archived notes, however, mentioned nothing of the sort, only a terse final entry. Sector sealed per Directive 7, secured access only. A cold, clear certainty washed over her. This was no glitch, no phantom echo. It was a destination, a place someone or something was deliberately signaling from. A place Omnicorp had gone to immense lengths to erase. The thrill of discovery was instantly tempered by a spike of primal fear. She was no longer just listening to a secret. She was actively uncovering a lie, and the weight of that knowledge felt like a physical pressure in the small room. Leo's concerns about corporate surveillance were no longer abstract paranoia but a very real and present danger. Every second she spent connected to these files was a risk, but the sight of those sealed sectors on the old map, the undeniable proof of a hidden geography, fueled a determination that burned brighter than any fear. The hunt was no longer a curiosity, it had become a mission. The time for digital ghosts and archived lies was over. The coordinates were a physical place, a destination etched not just in data, but in steel and concrete high above the teeming, neon-drenched streets where she had spent her entire life. Alara's plan was a fragile thing, woven from stolen moments and purloined access, a tightrope walk over a chasm of corporate oversight. The highest level of Niu Atlas, the Spire, was a prohibited zone, its very existence a whisper among the lower level. Populous, a place spoken of in the same breath as myths and corporate boogeymen. Officially, it was a sensitive atmospheric processing facility. Unofficially, it was the one place the archived maps and the ghostly signal agreed upon, and she intended to see it for herself. The key to her ascent was a thin, unassuming sliver of black polymer, a level 7 maintenance access card she had lifted from a careless tech during a crowded elevator ride. It was a master key to the city's arteries, the unadvertised maintenance tunnels and vertical conduits that ran like a secret nervous system behind the polished public facades. In the pre-dawn hours, when the artificial twilight of the residential sectors was at its dimmest, and the citizenry was lost in mandated sleep cycle lulls, she moved. Dressed in dunker, non-reflective coveralls, she slipped into a service hatch behind a groaning trash compactor's unit, the acrid smell of decay giving way to the sterile, metallic chill of the inner city. The maintenance tunnel was a narrow, oppressive space, lit by the intermittent crimson glow of emergency strips. The air hummed with the vibration of immense machinery, the great lungs and heart of Niu Atlas, a constant, shuddering reminder of the artificial world she inhabited. Her stolen card granted her passage through a series of heavy security doors, each one sighing open with a hydraulic hiss before sealing shut behind her, a series of locks clicking into place at her back. Her progress was a stop-start dance with the city's automated guardians. She pressed herself into shadowed alcoves as sleek, silent drones on patrol routes glided past, their multispectral sensors scanning the empty corridors. She memorized their patterns from schematics she had risked everything to download, her body coiled tight, every sense screaming. Each near miss sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, a cocktail of terror and exhilaration that was more potent than any of the state-sanctioned stimulants. As she ascended through the layers, the character of the city shifted around her. The grimy, lived-in chaos of the lower markets and residential blocks gave way to the cleaner, wider corridors of the commercial districts, and then to the eerily silent, climate-controlled halls of the corporate enclaves. The air itself changed, losing the familiar scent of recycled humanity and gaining a sterile, filtered quality that felt alien in her lungs. She was moving through the strata of power and control, climbing the ladder of the metropolis itself. With every new level, a fierce, defiant thrill grew within her, burning away the lingering fear. This was more than just a journey. It was an act of reclamation. Each step was a denial of the boundaries imposed upon her, a refusal to accept the curated reality she had been born into. She was a splinter working its way up through the layers of a giant, moving toward its hidden brain, driven by a signal and a truth that promised to shatter the world she knew. The hum of the city was no longer just a sound. It was the static of a lie, and she was climbing directly into its source. The final door was a monolith of weathered steel, standing alone at the terminus of a silent, dust-choked corridor. It was the end of the line, the absolute edge of the known world according to every map, every lesson, every whispered story of her life in the cavernous dark below. Alara stood before it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the air so still she could hear the soft rustle of her own coveralls. This was it. The coordinates had led here to this sealed, silent barrier. The archived maps labeled it Terminus Reach. The stark, freshly stenciled letters on the steel, glowing with a faint, malevolent orange in the low light, declared it a contaminated zone. Her mind conjured the images she had been fed since childhood: a scorched earth, a sky choked with poison, a world scoured clean of life by the ancient solar flares. She expected to find a dead place, a tomb sealed for the protection of those who lived in the manufactured safety below. Her hand, encased in a thin glove, hovered over the access panel. The stolen keycard felt flimsy, a child's toy against the implied might of this fortress door. This was the moment of no return. To open it was to invite in the very death the corporation had spent generations guarding against. Or so she had been taught. With a breath held tight in her lungs, she swiped the card. A soft beep acknowledged the command. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the soles of her boots, the massive door began to retract. It slid into the wall with the grinding protest of disused machinery, inch by laborious inch. She braced herself, her muscles tensed for a blast of corrosive wind, for the stench of ozone and decay, for the searing heat of a radioactive hellscape. Instead, a sliver of the unimaginable appeared. A gust of air hit her. First, it was not the stale, recycled breath of the city, but a living current, cool and clean, carrying scents so foreign and complex her brain struggled to categorize them. It was the smell of damp earth, of growing things, of open space. It was a fragrance she had only ever encountered in the historical archives, a sensory ghost from a lost world. The light that followed was even more impossible. It wasn't the flat, artificial glow of the city's neon and LEDs. It was a soft, golden radiance that spilled through the widening gap, warm and shifting, painting the grimy floor of the corridor in hues she had no name for. The door slid fully open and Alara's world shattered. She stood at the threshold, paralyzed, her mind reeling, refusing to process the data her eyes were sending. There was no toxic wasteland. There was no barren rock under a murderous sky. Before her stretched an expanse of vibrant, impossible green. A gentle slope of grass and wildflowers rolled away from the doorway, leading to a copse of trees whose leaves rustled in a breeze that felt like a caress. And above it all, above everything, was a sky of such profound, crystalline blue it felt like a physical blow. A real sun, not a projection, hung in its vastness, its light warm and gentle on her face. Her legs gave way, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the doorframe. The solid, cold metal was the only anchor to the reality she had known. Everything else was a beautiful, terrifying lie. The static from her workshop, the decoded numbers, the risky ascent, it had all led to this. Not to a dead end, but to a beginning. The foundation of her entire existence, every truth she had ever been told by the omnipresent voice of Omnicorp, crumbled into dust around her. The contaminated zone was not a graveyard. It was a garden, and the greatest contamination of all had been the lie buried deep in the heart of the city below. Ilara's first step onto the surface was a stumble, her body betraying her. Disbelief. The ground was not the unyielding permacrete of Neo-Atlas, but a soft, resilient carpet of living grass that yielded under her weight. She fell to her knees, her fingers digging into the soil, feeling the cool, damp earth, the tangled roots, the simple, profound reality of it. She brought a handful to her face, inhaling the rich, loamy scent, a perfume so potent and alien it made her head spin. This was not the sterile, manufactured world she had known. This was chaos and life, raw and untamed. Tilting her head back, she gazed into the endless expanse of the sky. It was a blue so deep and vast it felt like falling, a dome of impossible clarity punctuated by the gentle, radiant warmth of the sun. She had seen simulations, of course, pale, digital imitations in history modules, but nothing could have prepared her for the visceral reality of natural light on her skin, the caress of a breeze that carried the whispers of a world breathing on its own. Tears, hot and unbidden, streaked through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of a devastating, overwhelming joy, the shattering of a lifetime of accepted falsehoods. The world was not dead. It was here, vibrant and healing, just beyond the massive, lying door. Wiping her eyes, her gaze swept across the landscape. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of green and gold stretched into the distance, dotted with clusters of trees whose leaves shimmered in the sunlight. The air thrummed with a quiet symphony of life. The buzz of insects, the distant call of a bird, sounds she had only ever heard in archived recordings. And then she saw it. Nestled in a gentle valley about a kilometer away, a small collection of structures. They were not the towering, monolithic buildings of the city, but low, organic shapes built from reclaimed materials and earth, their roofs sporting glinting solar panels. Smoke curled from a central chimney, a frail, brave thread against the immense sky. A settlement. People, her heart hammered with a new, complex emotion, a mixture of hope and terror. Were they survivors, exiles, the source of the signal? Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to retreat back into the familiar lie of the underground. But the sight of that thin tendril of smoke, a testament to human presence in this reborn world, was a stronger pull. She moved forward, her steps cautious at first, then gaining purpose as she crossed the meadow. Each blade of grass brushing against her legs, each breath of unsullied air, was a confirmation. The official history was a grotesque fabrication, a cage built not from steel but from information. Omnicorp had not sealed the city to protect its people from a dead world. They had sealed them in, away from a living one, and the sheer, monstrous scale of that deception settled over her like a physical weight. The static in her workshop had not just been a signal. It had been a lifeline, and she had followed it out of the dark and into the blinding, beautiful truth. The settlement was a quiet hum of life nestled in the valley's embrace, a stark contrast to the mechanical roar Ilara had left behind. As she drew closer, details resolved from the organic shapes, gardens bursting with vegetables, rainwater collection systems, and children playing quietly near the dwellings. They stopped and stared as she approached, their eyes wide but not fearful. They were healthy, their skin touched by the sun, their clothes simple and patched. A man emerged from the largest structure, his movements calm and deliberate. He had a weathered face and eyes that held a deep, weary knowledge. This was Kale. He did not seem surprised to see her. He offered a cup of water from a clear, cold stream, and she drank greedily, the taste so pure it was almost shocking. He led her to a simple bench overlooking the settlement, the vast, open sky canopy above them. For a long moment they sat in silence, Ilara trying to order the chaos of her thoughts to fit this impossible reality into the framework of her life. When Kale finally spoke, his voice was low and even. carrying the weight of a story told too many times to those who arrive, one by one, from the dark below. He confirmed the core of the history she knew. The solar flares had been real, a cataclysm that had forced humanity underground centuries ago. But then he delivered the truth that unraveled everything. The radiation, the lethal sun, the surface as a perpetual tomb, it had all ended. The planet had begun its slow, stubborn healing decades ago. The ecosystems had stabilized, the skies had cleared. The danger was a ghost, a story kept on life support. Omnicorp, he explained, had not been a savior but a captor. In the chaos of the initial crisis, they had consolidated control over the underground infrastructure, the food synthesis, the air and water recycling. As the surface became livable again, they faced a simple, brutal equation: a population dependent on them. For survival was a source of limitless profit and power. A population that could walk out into the sunlight and build its own future was a threat to their absolute dominion. So, they perpetuated the myth. They scrubbed the archives, controlled the narrative, and enforced the lie with the unyielding certainty of a state religion. The surface was not a graveyard. It was a competitor, and it had to be erased from human memory. The people here, Kale said, were the descendants of those who had discovered the truth over the generations. Engineers who had seen the atmospheric data, rebels who had hacked the old servers, exiles cast out for asking the wrong questions. They lived in hiding not from a toxic environment, but from Omnicorp's surface drones and patrols, which actively hunted them to maintain the illusion of a dead world. Their existence was a fragile secret, a testament to a truth that could topple an empire. The signal she had decoded was their beacon, a desperate repeating whisper cast into the static, a hope that someone with the skill and courage to hear it would one day find her way out. Alara listened, the pieces of her world, the static, the lies, the sealed door, clicking into a horrifying, perfect picture. The cage had no lock. It was made of lies, and she had just walked through its walls. The weight of Kale's truth settled over Alara not as a revelation, but as a crushing, physical burden. The vibrant green of the valley, the gentle warmth of the sun on her skin, the clean air in her lungs, all of it was now tainted by the monstrous architecture of the lie that sustained it. This paradise was a secret kept at the point of a gun. As the initial shock ebbed, replaced by a cold, clarifying dread, Kale led her to the edge of the settlement, to a small, camouflaged shed housing their most critical piece of intelligence. A bank of monitors fed by a precarious network of hidden sensors and tapped data lines that reached back down into the belly of Neo-Atlas. The screens displayed schematics of the city's defense grid, a labyrinth of lethal protocols that Alara had only ever heard of in rumor. Kale's finger, calloused and steady, traced a specific heavily fortified subsystem labeled Aegis Protocol. His voice was grim, stripped of all the hope that had colored his earlier narrative. He explained that Omnicorp's control was not merely informational. It was physical, absolute, and ruthlessly automated. The corporation's greatest fear was not a few scattered exiles on the surface, but a mass awakening, a coordinated exodus from the underground. The Aegis Protocol was their final solution. Deep within the city's core systems was a dormant failsafe, an extermination routine designed for one scenario and one scenario only: a mass, unsanctioned movement toward the surface. If a critical number of citizens were detected attempting to breach the upper levels simultaneously, if the great, placid herd suddenly stampeded for the light, the system would not try to contain them. It would interpret the event as a catastrophic system failure, a terminal breach of its primary containment mandate, and its response would be to sterilize the threat. Kale's words were chilling in their precision. Vents would flood the upper transit hubs and ascension corridors with a fast-acting neurotoxin, colorless and odorless. Automated sentry turrets, hidden in the architecture, would deploy and purge any who survived. It was a slaughterhouse protocol, designed to eliminate thousands in minutes, to turn the promise of freedom into a charnel house. The entire ascent route, the very path Alara had so recently traveled, was a meticulously engineered kill box. The moral chasm that opened before her was vertiginous. She held in her mind the two possible futures, each a different kind of hell. In one, she could return to Neo-Atlas, bury the truth deep inside her, and live out her days in the gilded cage, watching her family and friends, Leo. Everyone continue their lives in blissful, manufactured ignorance. Their survival would be guaranteed, but it would be a phantom life, a performance in a play they didn't know was staged. In the other future, she could try to spread the truth, to spark the very exodus the Aegis Protocol was built to crush. She could become the catalyst for a massacre, her desire for freedom directly responsible for the deaths of thousands. The faces of the people in the market levels, the children playing in the sterile plazas, Leo's worried expression, they all flashed before her eyes, their lives balanced on the razor's edge of her decision. To free them was to risk murdering them. To save them was to condemn them to a lie. There was no right answer, only a choice between two profound and terrible betrayals. The silence of the surface was a living, breathing entity, a stark contrast to the constant mechanical drone of Neo-Atlas. It was a silence that allowed for thought, and for Alara that was its own form of torture. She sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock at the edge of the settlement, her gaze fixed on the distant, monolithic structure of the city, a dark, angular scar against the horizon. It was a tomb, and everyone she had ever known was inside. Dancing in the dark to a song they couldn't hear was a lie. Her mother, humming as she prepared synthetic meals in their cramped apartment. Her father, his shoulders permanently stooped from a lifetime of labor in the recycling plants. Leo, with his cautious intelligence and his fierce, fearful loyalty. Their faces swam in her vision, each one a stone added to the impossible burden she now carried. She was Atlas, and the sky she held was not the beautiful, open expanse above her, but the crushing weight of a stolen truth. The desire for freedom was a fire in her blood, a primal scream that had driven her to build antennas and pick locks and climb into the unknown. That fire now warred with a cold, suffocating dread. To act on that desire was to play with lives as if they were pieces on a game board, to gamble with a currency more precious than any data stream. The ethics of it were a tangled knot she could not unpick. Was it moral to leave them in ignorance, to preserve their lives at the cost of their very essence? Or was it a greater sin to risk their annihilation for a chance, however slim, at a real existence? The freedom she craved felt like a selfish, monstrous thing when weighed against the potential consequence of a city-wide grave. She watched a bird, a real living bird, wheel and dive in the blue vastness, a creature of perfect, unthinking liberty. The people below had never seen a bird. They had never felt real rain or genuine wind. Their world was a beautifully rendered prison, and she was the only one who knew the door was unlocked. The knowledge was a poison and a power, isolating her on this green hilltop more completely than any concrete wall ever could. She was no longer one of them. She was a keeper of secrets, a warden of their ignorance, and the responsibility was a cage of its own making. The vibrant world around her, the proof of life's resilience, was also a monument to humanity's capacity for control. The ultimate sacrifice was not giving up one's life, but being forced to choose between the freedom of millions and their very survival. The weight was unbearable, and it was hers alone to carry. The weight of the decision did not lessen, but it hardened, transforming from a paralyzing dread into a cold, sharp tool of focus. Alara could not unsee the sky, could not unknow the truth. Returning to the blissful ignorance of the underground was no longer an option. The memory of the sun on her face was a brand, a permanent mark of a reality that demanded to be shared. The dilemma was no longer a question of if she would act, but how she could act without triggering the apocalypse Omni-Corp had engineered. The answer, she realized, was not to lead a charge, but to disarm the trap. The Aegis protocol was a digital lock on the cage, and she was a lockpick. In the low, earth-scented confines of the settlement's command shed, a new kind of static filled the air, the hushed, intense energy of a war council. Gathered around a central table fashioned from salvaged shipping pallets were Kale, a few of his most trusted tech scouts, and Alara. The schematics of NeoAtlas's core network were displayed across a patched-together screen, a dizzying web of data conduits, security nodes, and the ominous, red-lined box representing the Aegis failsafe. The plan they began to weave was as fragile as a spider's silk and just as precise, a covert operation that would hinge on stealth, timing, and a deep, surgical strike into the city's digital heart. The vulnerability was not in the protocol itself. That was a fortress, but in the network that fed it data. Kale's people, over years of cautious observation, had identified a backdoor, a legacy maintenance line that had been left active for corporate engineers. It was a tiny crack in the Empire's wall, a fiber optic thread that connected the surface sensors to a secondary data hub deep within the city's mid-levels. This hub was the key. It was the point where the raw sensor data was processed before being sent to the core systems. If they could infiltrate that hub, they could feed the Aegis protocol a lie. Alara's role was the linchpin. She would have to return underground, re-enter the city's beating heart, and plant a virus directly into that hub. It would be a piece of code designed to act as a filter, to intercept the sensor data that monitored population density in the ascension zones. The virus would cloak any mass movement, presenting the system with a perpetual, placid status quo, no matter how many people streamed toward the surface. It was a digital sleight of hand, making the stampede invisible to the automated slaughterhouse. Roles were assigned with quiet efficiency. Kale would coordinate from the surface, using his tapped data lines to monitor OmniCorp's security chatter and provide real-time warnings. His scouts would create a diversion on the surface, a series of small, targeted disruptions to draw the attention of patrols away from the city's digital borders. And Alara would lead the assault from within, a lone data ghost moving through the city she had once called home, now the battlefield. She would need Leo. His access as a data analyst, his knowledge of the city's logistical networks, and his cautious, meticulous mind were assets she could not do without, even if convincing him would be its own monumental task. As the plan solidified, the crushing weight on Alara's shoulders shifted. It was no longer the burden of an impossible choice, but the focused pressure of a singular, monumental task. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now joined by a steely resolve. They were not planning a rebellion of force, but one of perception. They would not break down the door. They would simply convince the guard it was never open. The fate of a city now rested on a sliver of code and the steady hands of a hacker who had once only sought to escape the static, only to find herself tasked with silencing the most dangerous signal of all. The descent back into NeoAtlas was a journey into a ghost world. The vibrant greens and boundless sky of the surface were replaced by the familiar, suffocating embrace of permacrete and neon. Every breath of recycled air felt like a betrayal, every flicker of the artificial twilight a mockery of the sun she had left behind. Alara moved through the crowded thoroughfares not as a citizen, but as a phantom, her senses hyper-alert, the weight of the surface truth a secret shield against the city's lies. Her destination was Leo's clandestine data den, a hidden alcove tucked behind the whirring servers of a public library archive. Finding him was the easy part. Convincing him was a battle fought in hushed, frantic whispers amidst the hum of cooling fans. She showed him no pictures, offered no poetic descriptions of the surface. Instead, she presented cold, hard data, the archived maps, the sensor logs from Kale's network showing stable atmospheric readings, and the chilling, red-lined schematics of the Aegis protocol. Leo's face, illuminated by the cool blue of his monitors, cycled through disbelief, denial, and finally, a horrified, gut-wrenching acceptance. The fear in his eyes was palpable, a reflection of the corporate boogeyman they had been raised to dread. But beneath the fear, she saw the spark of the man who noticed patterns, and the pattern she presented was one of monstrous, systematic deception. His help would be reluctant, fueled more by a desperate need to prevent a massacre than by any hope of paradise, but it would be given. Their infiltration was a high-wire act performed in the digital shadows, using Leo's legitimate access as a cover. They carved a precarious path. Through OmniCorp's corporate intranet, a glittering fortress of data streams and security checkpoints. Ilara's custom scripts, elegant and silent, danced ahead of them, identifying patrol algorithms and weaving through firewall chinks. The target was the secondary data hub, a nondescript server cluster in a low-security sector. The legacy maintenance lined their only thread of hope. The air in the small den grew thick with tension, and the smell of overheated circuitry, every minute stretching into an eternity. The first major obstacle was a new, unscheduled data integrity sweep, a roaming security protocol that scanned for anomalous code. They saw it coming on their tracker, a wall of crimson light advancing through the network schematic toward their position. With seconds to spare, Ilara rerouted their connection through a decaying public entertainment server, the path clogged with decades of pirated media, masking their signal in a torrent of digital noise. The sweep passed over them, registering only the chaotic static of a million forgotten songs and shows. The second was a physical one, a routine patrol of enforcers, their armored forms casting long shadows, stopped just outside the library's server room door. Leo froze, his breath catching in his throat, his fingers hovering over the disconnect command. Ilara held a hand up, her own heart hammering. They listened to the muffled voices, the scrape of boots on the floor, waiting for the hiss of the door opening. It was a 90-second eternity of pure, undiluted terror before the footsteps receded. The close call left them both shaking, the reality of their situation a cold splash of water, but they pressed on. Finally, they reached the legacy line, the ancient fiber-optic thread that was their backdoor. The transfer of the virus was agonizingly slow, a trickle of data moving through a straw, each bite a potential trigger for an alarm. A progress bar crept across the screen, a digital heartbeat counting down to 0. With 10 seconds left, a new alert flashed. A network administrator had logged into an adjacent system for an unscheduled diagnostic. Leo's knuckles were white on the edge of the terminal. Ilara's gaze was locked on the bar, her entire being focused on that single, crawling pixel of light. It reached 100%. A soft chime signaled a successful, silent upload. The virus was planted, a sleeper agent now nestled deep within the city's nervous system, ready to blind the beast when the time came. They severed the connection, scrubbed their logs, and powered down the illicit hardware. In the sudden relative quiet of the den, they sat in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing. They had done it. They had slipped past the guardians and poisoned the well. But as the initial surge of triumph faded, it was replaced by a new, more profound tension. The trap was disarmed, but the clock was now ticking louder than ever. The city slept on, unknowing, balanced on the precipice of a truth that would shatter its world, and the two people who held the trigger could only wait in the fragile, static-filled silence. The silence that followed the virus's implantation was the most profound Ilara had ever experienced, a taut, breathless void waiting to be filled. It lasted only minutes. Then, across Nihu Atlas, the curated reality began to stutter and die. The augmented sky, a perpetual, placid twilight, flickered like a dying light bulb. For a heart-stopping moment, the true ceiling of the cavernous city was revealed, endless, grimy permacrete, stained by centuries of condensation and neglect, crisscrossed by skeletal maintenance gantries. Then, every public view screen, every personal community, every illuminated advertisement winked out, plunging the metropolis into a darkness broken only by the frantic pulse of emergency strobes. From that digital corpse, a new signal was born. It erupted from the very speakers that had, moments before, been broadcasting OmniCorp's soothing lies. It was Kale's voice, stripped of its weary patience, now ringing with a raw, undeniable urgency. The broadcast was simple, a recitation of the truth, accompanied by the evidence Ilara had provided, the stable atmospheric readings, the archived maps, the footage of the vibrant, living surface captured by hidden cameras. He spoke of the lie of the Aegis Protocol, of the garden waiting just beyond the great, sealed door. The words echoed through the silent, darkened corridors, a ghost in the machine finally given a megaphone. The reaction was not an instant, roaring stampede. It was a slow, disbelieving thaw. Citizens emerged from their apartments into the eerie half-light, their faces etched with confusion and a dawning, terrifying hope. They gathered around the dead view screens as if they were ancient campfires, listening to the impossible message repeat. They looked at each other, at the grim, ugly truth of the cavern roof now exposed above them, and the foundations of their world began to crack. Then a movement started, a quiet, determined flow of humanity toward the central transit hubs, toward the elevators and ascension corridors that led up. It was not a panic, it was a pilgrimage, a silent, collective decision to see for themselves. Omnicorp's retaliation was swift and brutal. The enforcers, their faceless helmets reflecting the strobe lights, descended upon the gathering crowds. Stun batons crackled, and the sharp, chemical tang of riot control gas began to stain the air. Armored vehicles rolled into the plazas, their loudspeakers blaring demands for dispersal, their presence a physical manifestation of the old fear. For a moment, it seemed the lie would be enforced by sheer, overwhelming force, that the dream of the surface would be beaten back into the dark. But Alara and her allies were already there, moving through the crowd not as leaders but as catalysts. She stood on the base of a deactivated fountain, Leo at her side. Their faces pale but resolute. They did not shout, did not fight. They simply linked arms with those around them, creating a human chain. The gesture spread, a silent, defiant contagion. People stopped fleeing the enforcers and turned to face them, standing their ground without a word, their passive forms a wall the batons and gas could not truly break. Kale's surface scouts, having slipped into the city during the chaos, moved through the throng, directing people toward alternative, safer ascension routes through the maintenance tunnels, the very paths Alara had once traveled alone. The standoff crystallized in the Grand Ascension Plaza, a vast, multi-leveled space that served as the city's primary artery. On one side, a solid line of enforcers, their weapons raised, a wall of polished armor and implicit violence. On the other, a sea of citizens, thousands strong, their silence more powerful than any scream. They stood, unmoving, their collective gaze fixed on the massive security. Gates that barred the way to the upper levels. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the hum of the enforcers' armor and the ragged, hopeful breath of the crowd. Alara, standing at the front of that sea, met the blank visor of the lead enforcer. She offered no challenge, only a quiet, unshakable certainty. The moment stretched, fragile and infinite. Then, a single, resonant clunk echoed through the plaza. The great security gate, its systems compromised by the very virus that had blinded the Aegis protocol, shuddered. With a groan of yielding metal, it began to retract, inch by slow, grinding inch. A sliver of pure, natural light, the first any of them had ever seen, cut through the artificial gloom of the plaza, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like gold dust. The enforcers did not fire. The crowd did not rush. They simply watched, transfixed, as the door to a new world opened before them. The path was clear, the future a vast, terrifying, and beautiful. Unknown. The outcome was not certain. The corporation's power was not broken, only circumvented. But in that beam of sunlight cutting through the dark heart of the city, there was no longer any doubt that a new chapter had begun. The way was open. The choice of what to build now belonged to them.